Fox finds abandoned baby in a box, but what she did next shocked everyone. On a misty morning in the dense forests of northern Maine, a red fox moved silently through the underbrush. The animal's russet coat blended perfectly with the autumn foliage as it navigated between fallen logs and damp ferns. Hunger propelled it forward. It had been a difficult season, with prey growing scarce as winter approached. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Tell us from which city you're watching. Us. Let's continue. The fox, a female with unusually bright amber eyes, paused suddenly. Her keen sense of smell detected something unfamiliar amid the typical forest scents. Something that didn't belong. She tilted her head, ears pivoting forward as a faint sound reached her. A muffled cry, almost like a whimper. Curiosity overrode caution. The fox changed direction, moving toward the strange sound with measured steps. The forest grew thicker. Here, the ground sloping gently downward toward a shallow ravine rarely visited by humans. The crying grew louder, interspersed with moments of silence that made the fox hesitate, unsure if she had imagined it. Then she saw it, a cardboard box, partially concealed beneath a pile of dry branches. It looked deliberately placed, as if someone had tried to hide it from view. Fresh footprints in the soft earth indicated that humans had been there not long ago. The fox circled the box warily, her instincts conflicted between investigation and retreat. The crying started again. With careful movements, the fox approached the box and peered inside. What she found was entirely unexpected. A human baby, its face wet with tears, tiny limbs moving weakly beneath a thin blanket. The infant's skin looked pale, almost bluish in the cold morning air. In the nearby town of Oak Ridge, Sheriff Jack Miller sipped his coffee while reviewing reports at his desk. At 52, Jack had served as the town's sheriff for over 15 years. His weathered face and salt and pepper hair reflected years spent outdoors. First as a forest ranger, then as law enforcement. He knew every trail and creek in the surrounding piney woods better than most locals. "Morning, Sheriff." Deputy Sarah Jenkins placed a folder on his desk. "Got those reports from the Henderson case. Nothing suspicious, just like you thought." Jack nodded. "Thanks, Sarah. Anything else I should know about?" Sarah hesitated. "Well, there's been talk at the diner. The Wilsons are worried sick about their daughter Ellie. She went off to Portland 3 months ago, pregnant and upset. They haven't heard from her since Tuesday." Jack frowned. Ellie Wilson, Thomas and Martha's girl. He remembered her as a bright, ambitious teenager who'd won scholarships to study nursing. She was pregnant, apparently. They didn't know until she was already 6 months along. Said she was coming home this week, had some news for them, then nothing. No calls, no messages. Have they filed a missing persons report? Not officially. They're hoping she just got delayed. But Martha seemed pretty worried when I saw her. "At the store yesterday." Jack rubbed his temples. "I'll stop by their place later today, see what's what." At the edge of town, in a modest farmhouse surrounded by apple orchards, Thomas Wilson stared blankly at the wall phone. Martha sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of untouched tea, her eyes red from crying. "Still nothing?" she asked, although she already knew the answer. Thomas shook his head. "Her phone goes straight to voicemail. I called the landlord in Portland again. Says he hasn't seen her since she packed up her things on Monday." Martha's hands trembled. "Something's wrong, Thomas. She would have called if she could. You know how responsible she is." "Sheriff's coming by later," Thomas said, sitting heavily across from his wife. "Maybe he can help." Martha nodded, but her expression remained fearful. What she hadn't told Thomas was the strange dream she'd had the night before. Ellie lost in the woods, crying out for help, while something with bright eyes watched from the shadows. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, the fox had made a decision that defied natural instinct. Instead of leaving the human infant to its fate, she began carefully dragging the box toward an abandoned burrow she knew of nearby. The den, once belonging to a larger animal, offered shelter from the wind and approaching rain. The box snagged on roots and rocks, forcing her to stop frequently, but the fox persisted with unusual determination. Once at the den, she worked to expand the entrance slightly, making it large enough to accommodate the box. The baby had grown. Quieter, its cries reduced to occasional whimpers. The fox settled near the infant, providing warmth and a vigilant presence. As darkness approached, she left briefly to hunt, returning with small morsels of food that she placed near the box, though the baby was too young to eat solid food. This unlikely vigil continued through the night. The fox remained alert to every sound: the hoot of owls, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of nocturnal creatures. Each potential threat was assessed, the fox ready to defend her unexpected charge, if necessary. In Oakridge, Jack Miller sat in the Wilsons' living room, notebook open on his knee. "When exactly did you last hear from Ellie?" "Tuesday morning," Martha replied. "She called to say she was leaving Portland, driving back home. Said she had important news that couldn't wait." "Did she say what kind of news?" Martha and Thomas exchanged glances. "No," Thomas answered, "but she sounded, I don't know, excited maybe. Nervous too." Jack made notes. "And the pregnancy, how was she handling that?" Martha sighed. "It was difficult at first. She wouldn't tell us who the father was, just that he wasn't in the picture. But these last few months, she seemed to come around to the idea of being a mother. Started buying baby things, making plans." "Did she mention any problems? Anyone who might wish her harm?" Thomas shook his head firmly. "Ellie keeps to herself mostly. Always has. Folks around here respect her." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "Her car's a blue Honda Civic, right? I'll put out an alert, check with Highway Patrol between here and Portland. Also, I'd like to take a look at her room if that's all right." The Wilsons led him upstairs to a bedroom that looked frozen in time. High school pennants on the wall, bookshelves filled with medical textbooks, a collection of forest animal figurines on the dresser. Jack noticed a framed photo of a younger Ellie standing proudly next to an environmental conservation award. "She always loved the forest," Martha said softly, following his gaze. "Used to volunteer for the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center during summers." Jack's eyes fell on a small wooden box on the nightstand. "Mind if I have a look?" Inside the box, he found a delicate silver pendant with an unusual symbol engraved on it, a tree with roots that formed a perfect circle. "Family heirloom," Thomas explained. "Belonged to Martha's grandmother. Ellie never goes anywhere without it." Jack's expression grew more concerned. "Was she wearing it when she left Portland?" "Always," Martha confirmed. "Why?" Jack carefully closed the box. "Just building a complete picture, that's all." He didn't mention that the symbol looked familiar, identical to one he'd seen in historical records about the original settlers of Oakridge. A family line supposedly ended generations ago after a brutal attack by bandits during the region's lawless days. As Jack left the Wilson home, heavy clouds gathered overhead, promising the first significant rainfall of the season. Unknown to him, those same clouds loomed over the forest, where the fox continued her strange vigil, protecting a baby whose presence would soon upend the quiet routines of Oakridge and uncover secrets long buried in its past. Miles away, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of Portland. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, phone pressed to his ear. "Nothing yet," he said tensely. "But we've narrowed the search area. She couldn't have gone far." He listened for a moment, his expression hardening. "Yes, I understand what's at stake. The child cannot be found by anyone but us." As night fell over Maine, 3 separate vigils continued. Martha Wilson praying by her window, Jack Miller poring over maps of the areas between Portland and Oak Ridge, and a red fox curled protectively around a cardboard box in a forest den, her amber eyes gleaming in the darkness as the first raindrops began to fall. Dawn broke over Piney Woods, with the remnants of rain still clinging to every leaf and branch. The storm had passed, but a penetrating chill remained in the air. In the makeshift den, the fox stirred, her fur damp from ventures outside during the night. The baby had cried intermittently, pushing the fox to make frequent checks of the surroundings, ensuring no predators were drawn by the sound. The infant's face was flushed now, perhaps too warm despite the cold air. The fox sensed something, was wrong, but could do little except maintain her protective watch. She ventured out again as light filtered through the trees, driven by an instinct she couldn't explain. Several miles away, Jack Miller started his day earlier than usual. After a restless night reviewing maps and making calls, he decided to check Ellie Wilson's possible routes himself. He loaded his truck with emergency gear, a detailed topographical map of the region, and his old tracking kit from his ranger days. "Going somewhere, Sheriff?" Deputy Sarah Jenkins approached, coffee in hand. "Taking a personal day," Jack replied, securing his equipment. "Got some ground I want to cover regarding Ellie Wilson." Sarah nodded. "Any particular reason you're bringing tracking gear?" Jack hesitated. "Just a hunch. Martha mentioned Ellie loves the forests around here. If she had car trouble and tried to walk, she might have taken a shortcut through the woods. Want some company? I'm off duty at noon." "I appreciate it, but this might be nothing. Just an old man following instincts that are probably rusty as hell." Jack smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "Keep an eye on things here, will you? And if anyone asks, I'm checking some hunting cabins up north." Sarah looked puzzled. "Anyone in particular you're worried about asking?" Jack's expression clouded. "Did you notice the black SUV parked outside the diner yesterday? Out-of-state plates, tinted windows." "Can't say I did." "Two men in suits." Asked Doris some questions about recent arrivals in town. "They didn't look like tourists or business types." Sarah frowned. "You think they're connected to Ellie?" "I don't know," Jack admitted. "But until I do, let's keep my whereabouts between us." By mid-morning, Jack had checked 2 possible routes from Portland to Oak Ridge without finding any sign of Ellie's blue Honda. The third route took him along a less traveled forest road that locals sometimes used as a shortcut. The pavement eventually gave way to gravel, then dirt, forcing him to slow considerably. He was about to turn back when something caught his eye, tire tracks veering suddenly off the road, partially obscured by fallen leaves. Jack parked and approached on foot, following the tracks to a small clearing where it appeared a vehicle had stopped abruptly. Looking closer, he found footprints in the soft earth. Someone had exited the vehicle and moved toward the denser part of the forest. Jack's training kicked in. He photographed the scene with his phone, then began a methodical search of the area. The footprints indicated someone, likely a woman based on the size, had walked about 50 yards into the woods before the trail became harder to follow on the rocky ground. He marked the location on his GPS and continued searching outward, in expanding circles. Near a fallen oak, something glinted among the leaves. Jack knelt and carefully picked up a delicate silver chain, a broken necklace, the pendant missing. His heart rate quickened. This could be Ellie's family heirloom. Jack stood slowly, surveying the area with new intensity. If Ellie had been here, why had she left the road? Was she running from something or towards something? The absence of any sign of struggle was both reassuring and perplexing. Jack decided to follow the direction of the footprints deeper into the forest, marking his path carefully as he went. In Oak Ridge, Martha Wilson sat at her kitchen table with Thomas, both exhausted from another sleepless night. The phone rang, startling them. "Mrs. Wilson?" An unfamiliar male voice spoke when Martha answered. My name is Daniel Barrett. I'm a lawyer representing the father of your daughter's child. Martha's hand tightened on the receiver. Who is this? How did you get this number? My client wishes to remain anonymous for now, but he's very concerned about Ellie and the baby. He'd like to help locate them. Thomas took the phone. Listen here, if your client is so concerned, where has he been all this time? Ellie told us he wanted nothing to do with the baby. There was a pause. I believe there's been a misunderstanding, Mr. Wilson. My client only recently learned about the pregnancy. He's quite eager to provide support and ensure both Ellie and the child are safe. What's his name? Thomas demanded. As I said, he prefers anonymity at this stage, but he's prepared to offer substantial resources to help find your daughter. Perhaps we could meet to discuss. Thomas cut him off. We're working with the sheriff. Any information you have should go through him. He hung up, hands shaking. Martha stared at him. Who was that? What did he want? Said he represents the baby's father. Something feels off about it. Thomas reached for his coat. I'm going to tell Sheriff Miller about this. He's not at the station today, Martha said. Sarah told me he's checking some hunting cabins. Thomas frowned. Then I'll talk to Sarah. This doesn't feel right. Back in the forest, the fox had managed to catch a small rodent. Her instinct was to eat it immediately, but instead, she carried it back to the den. The baby was crying again, louder now, its face red and body warm to the touch. The fox paced anxiously, torn between staying and seeking help in some inexplicable way. A sudden noise outside the den caused her to freeze. Heavy footsteps approached, human footsteps. The fox retreated into the shadows of the den, positioned. Between the baby and the entrance, her muscles tense and ready. Jack Miller knelt by a small stream, examining unusual tracks in the mud. What had initially looked like human footprints occasionally mixed with what appeared to be fox tracks, an unlikely combination that piqued his professional curiosity. Following them had led him on a winding path deeper into the forest than he'd intended to go. The crying sound reached him faintly at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind in the trees. Then it came again, unmistakably the cry of an infant. Jack stood quickly, trying to pinpoint the direction. He moved cautiously toward the sound, one hand on the holster at his hip, out of habit. The crying led him to what appeared to be an abandoned animal den, recently enlarged. Jack approached slowly, calling out, "Hello? Anyone there?" The crying continued, but no human voice responded. Cautiously, Jack knelt by the entrance, peering into the darkness. What he saw made him catch his breath, a cardboard box containing an infant, and beside it, the amber eyes of a fox staring directly at him, its body positioned defensively. "Well, I'll be damned," Jack whispered. Carefully, he reached for his flashlight, moving with deliberate slowness to avoid startling the fox. The beam illuminated the scene fully. A baby, perhaps a few weeks old, wrapped in a thin blanket inside a box that had been dragged into the den. The fox, rather than fleeing from the light, remained in place, watching him intently. Jack assessed the situation rapidly. The baby needed medical attention immediately. Its cries sounded weak, and even from the entrance, he could see the infant's flushed face suggested fever. But any sudden movement might cause the fox to either attack or flee, potentially injuring the child in the process. "Easy now," he murmured, as much to himself as to the fox. "I'm here to help." To his astonishment, as he inched forward, the fox backed away slightly but didn't run or show aggression. It maintained its position near the baby, eyes never leaving Jack's face. With extreme caution, Jack reached into the box. The baby's skin was hot to the touch, confirming his fears about fever. He needed to get the child to a hospital quickly. As he carefully lifted the infant, something caught his eye. A small silver pendant tangled in the blanket, bearing the same unusual symbol he'd seen in Ellie Wilson's bedroom. His heart sank. "Oh, Ellie," he whispered, "what happened to you?" The fox watched as Jack wrapped the baby more securely in his jacket. He spoke softly to the animal, an automatic response born from years in the wilderness. "Thank you for watching over this little one. I don't know how or why, but you did good." To Jack's continued amazement, the fox followed as he carefully backed out of the den with the baby. It maintained a cautious distance, but showed no sign of retreating into the forest. Instead, it seemed to be watching, assessing his intentions. As Jack began the trek back to his vehicle, the gravity of his discovery weighed heavily on him. This was almost certainly Ellie Wilson's baby. But where was Ellie? The broken necklace, the tracks leading from the road, the abandoned infant. None of it made sense unless something had happened to her, something that had left her unable to care for her child. The fox shadowed him through the forest, sometimes visible, sometimes just a rustle in the underbrush. Jack found himself, oddly, grateful for the animal's presence, as if it were somehow validating his rescue mission. But questions multiplied with each step. Who had left the baby in the woods, and why? What connection did this have to the mysterious men asking questions in town? And most pressingly, what would he find when he followed the rest of the tracks, leading away from where the baby had been found? As the tree line came into view, with his truck waiting beyond, Jack made a decision. He would take the baby directly to the hospital in the neighboring town of Riverdale rather than Oak Ridge. Something told him that discretion was essential until he understood more about what had happened in these woods. The fox stopped at the edge of the forest, watching as Jack carried the infant to his vehicle. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, the weathered sheriff and the wild creature that had defied nature to protect a human child. Then the fox turned and disappeared silently into the shadows of piney woods, leaving Jack with a story no one would believe and a mystery that was only beginning to unfold. The pediatric wing of Riverdale Memorial Hospital buzzed with quiet efficiency as Dr. Amelia Carter examined the infant Jack had brought in. Her expression grew increasingly concerned as she completed her assessment. "This baby is severely dehydrated and has an infection," she told Jack, who waited anxiously nearby. "How long did you say it was in the woods?" "I don't know exactly," Jack admitted. "Could be hours, could be days." Dr. Carter shook her head in disbelief. "It's remarkable the child survived at all. You said a fox was guarding it?" Jack nodded, fully aware of how implausible it sounded. "I know it's hard to believe. I've worked in rural medicine for 15 years, Sheriff. I've heard stranger things." Dr. Carter gently inserted an IV into the baby's tiny arm. "What I find more difficult to believe is that someone abandoned this newborn in the forest. This doesn't look like a desperate teenager's panic. The baby was wearing clean clothes, and that pendant is valuable." Jack fingered the silver pendant he'd removed from the blanket. "Any way to determine exactly how old the baby is?" "Based on development, I'd say about 3 weeks. It's a girl, by the way." Dr. Carter made notes in the chart. "I've called social services, but they won't be here until morning. Hospital policy requires we report abandoned infants immediately." Jack frowned. "I'd appreciate if you could delay that report until tomorrow. There are complications I need to sort out first." Dr. Carter studied him carefully. "This isn't just about an abandoned baby, is it?" "The mother is missing," Jack explained. "Ellie Wilson. Her parents live in my jurisdiction. I have reason to believe she didn't abandon her child willingly." After a long pause, Dr. Carter nodded. "I can give you until morning, Sheriff. That's the best I can do." "Thank you. I'm going to leave Deputy Collins here." Jack gestured to the young officer who had met him at the hospital, "to keep an eye on things while I head back to follow up on some leads." "One more thing," Dr. Carter added as Jack turned to leave. "The baby had this clutched in her hand." She held out a small tuft of russet fur. Jack took it wordlessly, his mind spinning with implications. The drive back to Oak Ridge gave Jack time to organize his thoughts. The most logical explanation was that Ellie had been forced off the road, perhaps by the men in the black SUV. But what had happened next? Had she hidden her baby to protect it? And how had the fox become involved? As he pulled into the sheriff's station parking lot, Sarah Jenkins hurried out to meet him. "Thomas Wilson's been trying to reach you," she said without preamble. "Says they got a strange call about Ellie from someone claiming to represent the baby's father." Jack's expression darkened. "When did this happen?" "Few hours ago. And there's something else. Those men in suits. They've been asking more questions around town, specifically about any babies recently born in the area." Inside his office, Jack called Thomas Wilson immediately. After hearing about the mysterious lawyer, Jack's suspicions deepened. Did he leave a number? Any way to contact him? "No," Thomas replied, "but he mentioned a company name, Evergreen Consulting. Said they'd be in touch again." "Thomas, I need you and Martha to stay home tonight. Don't answer the door or phone unless it's me or Sarah." "You're scaring me, Jack. What's going on? Have you found something?" Jack hesitated. "I'm following some leads. I'll come by first thing tomorrow morning, I promise." After hanging up, Jack turned to Sarah. "I need everything you can find on Evergreen Consulting, and pull the historical records about the original settlers of Oak Ridge, specifically anything about the family that used a tree and circle symbol." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "The Elliots? They're practically town folklore at this point. The lost founding family." "Humor me," Jack said, "and see if there's any connection between them and the Wilsons." While Sarah worked, Jack spread out his forest maps. The area where he'd found the baby was part of an old section of woodland that had never been developed, sacred ground according to local indigenous law. It bordered what had once been Elliott family land, before the property changed hands multiple times over generations. The station door opened, and Henry Brooks, the town's elderly librarian and unofficial historian, entered carrying a large leather-bound book. "Sarah called," he explained, placing the book on Jack's desk. "Said you were interested in the Elliott family." Jack gestured to a chair. "What can you tell me about them, Henry, beyond the basic town history?" Henry settled in, adjusting his glasses. "The Elliots were the first to settle this area in 1802, wealthy family from Boston, led by William Elliott. They established the lumber operation that built this town." He opened the book to reveal faded photographs and handwritten accounts. "But what most people don't know is that the attack that supposedly ended their line in 1879 didn't actually kill everyone." Jack leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "Historical records show that William's great-granddaughter, Catherine Elliott, survived the attack. She was around 20 at the time, pregnant with her first child. Story goes, she escaped into the forest during the chaos, aided by a local trapper who found her days later." Henry turned to another page, showing a faded portrait of a young woman with striking features. Catherine eventually married the trapper and changed her name to Howard. They had several children, but kept her Elliott heritage secret out of fear the attackers might return. Jack's pulse quickened. "The Howards from the north side of the county," Henry nodded, "and through a daughter who married a Taylor, who had a daughter who married a Wilson." He looked at Jack significantly. "Thomas Wilson's grandmother was Catherine Elliott's great-granddaughter, making Ellie a direct descendant," Jack said quietly. "With a legitimate claim to the original Elliott lands and assets," Henry confirmed, "which, considering what was discovered there about 15 years ago, might be considerable." Sarah, who had been listening intently, looked confused. "What was discovered?" "Natural gas deposits," Jack answered, remembering the contentious town. "And meetings. A survey team found substantial reserves under the old Elliott property, but the land had been sold to Evergreen Holdings by then." Henry nodded gravely. "Convenient timing, wasn't it? The survey was conducted just months after the last known Elliott descendant with documentation Martha Wilson's mother passed away. Sarah's computer chimed. I've got something on Evergreen Consulting. It's a subsidiary of Evergreen Holdings, owned by James Prescott. Jack recognized the name immediately. Prescott was a business magnate with influential connections throughout the state. His company had been pushing for increased drilling rights in the region for years. Sarah called Judge Reynolds. I need an emergency search warrant for Prescott's local office. Jack stood, checking his weapon. And get me everything you can find about Daniel Barrett, the lawyer who contacted the Wilsons. You think Prescott is behind Ellie's disappearance? Sarah asked. I think Ellie discovered something about her heritage, maybe found documentation proving her lineage. If Prescott realized she could challenge his ownership of those gas-rich lands. Jack let the implication hang in the air. But abandoning her baby in the woods? That's extreme even for corporate greed, Sarah argued. I don't think Prescott or his men did that, Jack said thoughtfully. I think Ellie did, to protect her child. He fingered the pendant. This symbol would have identified the baby as an Elliott descendant. Ellie must have realized she was being followed, drove off the main road deliberately, and hid her child where Prescott's men wouldn't think to look. But how did she know the baby would be safe? Henry asked. Jack remembered the fox, its unusual behavior, the way it had followed him partway through the forest. I don't know, he admitted, but something tells me Ellie knew exactly what she was doing. In the meantime, deep in Piney Woods, the fox had returned to the abandoned den. Though the baby was gone, the animal lingered, sniffing at the cardboard box and the blanket scraps left behind. Something compelled her to remain nearby, a sense that her unusual duty wasn't yet complete. As darkness fell again, the fox's keen senses detected unfamiliar scents, humans moving through the forest with none of the usual noise or light. She melted into the underbrush, watching as three men in dark clothing systematically searched the area, their voices low and urgent. The tracker shows it stopped around here, one man said, checking a device in his hand. The pendant signal is gone, but this is definitely where it last transmitted. Spread out, another ordered. The boss wants that baby found tonight. The fox observed their movements, staying downwind and invisible in the growing darkness. These humans moved differently than the one who had taken the infant. They carried a threatening energy that triggered her deepest survival instincts. Yet instead of fleeing, she shadowed them, her behavior once again defying natural explanation. Back in Oak Ridge, Martha Wilson sat by her window, a family Bible open in her lap. She'd spent hours poring over the family genealogy recorded in its pages, connecting dots she'd never before considered important. Her grandmother had always hinted at distinguished ancestry, but Martha had dismissed it as an old woman's fancy. Now, as she traced the names backward through generations, the truth seemed undeniable. The missing pages her grandmother had mentioned, torn out, she'd claimed, by someone who didn't want the family history preserved, would have shown the direct line to Catherine Elliott. The doorbell rang, startling her. Thomas was upstairs resting after taking his heart medication. Martha approached the front door cautiously, remembering Jack's warning. Mrs. Wilson? A woman's voice called through the door. My name is Rebecca Summers. I'm a nurse who worked with Ellie in Portland. I have information about your daughter. Martha hesitated, her hand on the lock. Sheriff Miller asked us not to open the door for anyone. Please, the woman pleaded. Ellie gave me something to deliver to you if anything happened. To her. She was scared, Mrs. Wilson. She said people were following her. Against her better judgment, Martha opened the door a crack, chain still engaged. A professional-looking woman in her 30s stood on the porch, holding a manila envelope. Ellie wanted you to have this, the woman said, offering the envelope through the narrow opening. She said it explains everything about her baby's father and why she had to leave Portland suddenly. Martha took the envelope with trembling hands. You saw Ellie recently. Is she all right? The woman's expression turned somber. I haven't seen her since Monday when she gave me this. But she was terrified, Mrs. Wilson, said someone had discovered who she really was and that she needed to protect her baby at all costs. Nash? Who she really was, Martha repeated, confused. And Elliot, the woman said quietly, the last of the original Oak Ridge founders with a documented claim. Martha felt her knees weaken. How had Ellie discovered this when Martha herself had only just pieced it together tonight? Read the documents, the woman urged, and call the number inside if you want to help Ellie, but don't tell Sheriff Miller. Ellie said he might be compromised. As the woman turned to leave, Martha noticed a black SUV parked down the street, its engine running. A chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the night air. Closing and locking the door, Martha took the envelope to the kitchen table. Inside, she found several pages of legal documents and a handwritten note in what appeared to be Ellie's writing. The note was brief. Mom, if you're reading this, I'm in trouble. The baby is the heir. Keep her safe. Trust the Forest Guardian. Love, Ellie. Martha stared at the cryptic message, tears blurring her vision. What did Ellie mean by Forest Guardian? And why wouldn't she trust Jack Miller, who had been a family friend for decades? As she examined the legal documents, Martha failed to notice the small tracking device attached to the envelope's seal, a device now actively transmitting her location to the same men searching the forest. Guided by the orders of James Prescott, who was determined to eliminate any threat to his claim on what might be the most valuable natural gas deposit in the state. In Riverdale Hospital, the baby girl slept peacefully under the watchful eye of Deputy Collins. Dr. Carter had just completed another round of checks, pleased with the infant's improving condition. She's a fighter, Dr. Carter told the deputy. Another day of antibiotics, and she should be stable enough for discharge. To social services, neither of them noticed the hospital's security camera in the hallway outside, pivoting slightly, its focus adjusting to provide a clear view of the pediatric ward entrance. Miles away, in a sleek high-rise office, a technician monitored the feed on one of several screens. "Sir," he called to the man standing by the window, "we've located the child." Jack Miller pulled up to the Riverdale Hospital just before dawn, exhaustion etched into his features. He hadn't slept, spending the night. Instead, gathering information on James Prescott and Evergreen Holdings. What he'd uncovered was troubling, a pattern of aggressive land acquisition throughout the region, often targeting properties with unclear ownership or disputed titles. Deputy Collins met him in the hospital lobby, looking equally tired after his overnight watch. "Everything's quiet, Sheriff. Baby's doing better according to the night nurse." "Any visitors or unusual activity?" Jack asked, scanning the quiet hallway. "Nothing. Couple of ambulances came and went, regular hospital stuff." Collins hesitated. "But I did notice something odd about the security cameras. One in the hallway kept adjusting itself throughout the night." Jack frowned. "Automated system. That's what security said when I asked. Still seemed strange." Jack's instincts honed. By years of law enforcement prickled with alarm. "Let's check on the baby. Then I want to talk to hospital security." As they approached the pediatric unit, Dr. Carter emerged from a patient room, clipboard in hand. She seemed surprised to see Jack. "Sheriff, I wasn't expecting you this early." "How's our young patient?" Jack asked. "Responding well to treatment. Fever's down, hydration improved." Dr. Carter led them to a small room where the baby girl lay sleeping in a hospital bassinet. "She's quite resilient." Jack studied the infant's face, struck by the peaceful expression despite all she'd endured. The reality of what they were dealing with suddenly felt more immediate. This wasn't just a case, but a child's life hanging in the balance. "I need to move her," he said abruptly. "Today, this facility isn't secure enough." Dr. Carter looked startled. "She's still receiving treatment. Moving her would be necessary." Jack interrupted firmly. "Doctor, this child's mother is missing, and powerful people are looking for this baby. Can your treatment be continued somewhere else?" After a moment of consideration, Dr. Carter nodded reluctantly. "I could arrange for mobile medical support, if absolutely necessary, but she needs at least another 12 hours on IV antibiotics." "Make the arrangements," Jack instructed. "The fewer people who know, the better." He turned to Collins. "I want you to stay with her until I get back. No one enters this room except Dr. Carter." Back in Oak Ridge, Martha Wilson had spent a sleepless night reviewing the documents from the envelope. They included land surveys, historical property records, and legal opinions suggesting that the Elliott family's original land grants had never been properly transferred after the 1879 attack. More disturbingly, there were copies of emails between James Prescott and various officials discussing how to ensure that no legitimate heirs could ever stake a claim. Thomas found her at the kitchen table. Papers spread everywhere. "Martha, have you been up all night? What is all this?" Martha looked up, her eyes red but alert. "It's Ellie's heritage. Our heritage. Thomas, we're directly descended from the Elliots, the founding family of Oak Ridge." Thomas sat heavily, scanning the documents with growing concern. "Where did you get these?" Martha explained about the woman's visit, showing him Ellie's note. Thomas read it several times, his expression darkening. "We need to call Jack right away. This doesn't feel right." "The note says not to trust him," Martha reminded her husband. Thomas shook his head firmly. "I've known Jack Miller for 40 years. If there's one person in this town we can trust, it's him." As Thomas reached for the phone, a loud knock at the front door startled them both. Through the window, Martha could see two men in suits standing on their porch. "Mr. and Mrs. Wilson?" One called out, "We're associates of Daniel Barrett. We'd like to speak with you about your daughter." Thomas moved toward the door, but Martha grabbed his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "Look." She pointed to the black SUV parked in their driveway, the same one she'd seen the night before after the woman's visit. Thomas nodded understanding and quietly led Martha toward the back of the house. "We'll go out the back door and through the Petersons' yard," he whispered. "My truck is in the garage." The knocking grew more insistent as they slipped out the rear entrance. Once safely in Thomas's truck, hidden from view by the detached garage, Martha called Jack's cell phone. "Jack, it's Martha Wilson," she said when he answered. "There are men at our house. They say they work with that Barrett person who called yesterday." "Where are you now?" Jack's voice was tense. "In Thomas's truck behind the garage. They haven't seen us yet." "Good. Stay there. I'm sending Sarah to meet you." There was a pause. "Martha, did anything unusual happen last night after I spoke with Thomas?" Martha described the woman's visit and the mysterious envelope. Jack's response was immediate. "Get rid of that envelope now. It's probably being tracked. And Martha, don't go to your sister's place or anywhere they might expect. Head to Calvin Tucker's hunting cabin instead. Sarah will meet you there." Meanwhile, in the depths of Piney Woods, the three men who had been searching through the night looked increasingly frustrated. "The pendant signal is completely gone," one complained, checking his device again. "And now the backup tracker at the Wilson house is on the move." The leader of the group, a hard-faced man with military precision to his movements, consulted his phone. "New orders. Wilson residence is being handled. We're to continue searching more. This area. The boss believes the mother might still be nearby." "We've been at it all night," the third man protested. "There's nothing here but trees and—" He froze, staring at something on the ground ahead. The leader followed his gaze to what appeared to be fresh footprints in the soft earth, small, feminine prints, alongside the paw prints of a medium-sized animal. "Well now," he said softly, "isn't that interesting?" Unseen, the fox observed from the dense underbrush. She had been following these men for hours, driven by some inexplicable purpose. When they discovered the tracks, her tracks, intermingled with others she had been following since dawn, The fox retreated silently, moving in a direction the men had not yet explored. Her path led to a dilapidated hunter's cabin deep in the woods, its roof partially collapsed and windows long since shattered. To human eyes it would appear abandoned for years, but the fox's sensitive nose detected recent human presence, specifically the same scent that had been on the baby and its blankets. Inside the cabin, hidden beneath loose floorboards, Ellie Wilson huddled in a small cellar space, her body weak from injury and exposure. She had been there for days, surviving on the emergency supplies she'd stashed weeks earlier when she first suspected she was being followed. A noise outside made her tense, ready to retreat deeper into her hiding place. But rather than the heavy tread of searching men, she heard the light scratch of animal claws on wood. A moment later, a russet face appeared at the narrow opening, the same fox that had found her baby in the cardboard box. Ellie stared in disbelief. She had left her newborn daughter in the forest as a desperate last resort, hoping against hope that the local legends about the wood's protective spirits might prove true. When she'd seen the fox approach the cardboard box that night, watching with unusual intelligence, Ellie had made the heart-wrenching decision to leave her child under the animal's apparent guardianship while she led Prescott's men away. "You found me?" Ellie whispered, her voice cracked from disuse. "Is my baby safe?" The fox made no sound, but its alert posture and the way it repeatedly looked back toward the forest seemed almost like communication. After a moment, it disappeared from view, only to return minutes later, dropping something beside the opening, a scrap of fabric that Ellie recognized from the blanket she had wrapped her daughter in. Tears filled her eyes. Somehow, she understood. Her baby had been found, not by Prescott's men, but by someone else. The fabric was clean, suggesting her daughter was being cared for. Drawing on her last reserves of strength, Ellie pulled herself from the hiding place. She had to find her child and get to safety. The documents she'd discovered in the Portland Historical Archives, proving her lineage and the illegal nature of the land transfers that had given Prescott control of the Elliott properties, needed to reach the proper authorities. At Riverdale Hospital, Jack's plan to move the baby was already in motion. Dr. Carter had arranged for a private pediatric transport to a secure medical facility in Augusta, using a cover story about a transfer for specialized treatment. "The ambulance will be ready in an hour," she told Jack. "I've prepared a portable medical kit with everything she'll need during transport." Jack nodded appreciatively. "Thank you for understanding the urgency." "I don't understand all of it," Dr. Carter admitted, "but I know enough to recognize when a child is in danger." Jack's phone rang, Sarah Jenkins calling from the sheriff's station. "Jack, you need to get back here," she said without preamble. "Judge Reynolds signed your warrant for Prescott's office, but there's a complication. His security team is refusing entry without Prescott himself present, and he's conveniently unreachable." "What about the Wilsons?" "I've got them at Tucker's cabin. They're safe for now, but they're pretty shaken. Martha showed me the documents Ellie sent. Jack, this is bigger than we thought. There's evidence of bribery, falsified records going back decades." Jack made a quick decision. "Stay with the Wilsons. I'll handle Prescott's office after I get the baby secured." He hung up and turned to Collins. "Change of plans. You'll escort the baby with Dr. Carter. I need to get back to Oak Ridge." As Jack hurried toward the hospital exit, an ambulance pulled into the emergency bay. Not unusual for a hospital, but something about the timing made Jack pause. Two paramedics emerged, moving with purpose toward the entrance. Their uniforms looked correct at first glance, but Jack noticed a subtle discrepancy in the insignia. Acting on instinct, Jack stepped back into a side corridor, watching as the two men consulted with the front desk receptionist. Even from a distance, he could see them showing ID badges and discussing a patient transfer. Jack slipped back to the pediatric unit through a service corridor. "We need to move now," he told Collins and Dr. Carter. "There are men at reception. who I believe are here for the baby." Dr. Carter looked alarmed. "But the transport isn't ready. We don't have a choice." Jack quickly considered options. "Is there another way out of this unit?" "Service elevator at the end of the hall," Dr. Carter replied. "It leads to the loading dock." "Collins, get my truck from the main lot and bring it around to the loading dock," Jack ordered, tossing him the keys. "Doctor, what's the quickest way to disconnect the baby from the medical equipment?" Minutes later, Jack descended in the service elevator with Dr. Carter and the baby, who was securely wrapped in a special transport blanket with a portable oxygen monitor. They reached the loading dock just as Collins pulled up in Jack's truck. "Anyone follow you?" Jack asked, as they quickly transferred the baby into the back seat where Dr. Carter would continue monitoring her. "Don't think so," Collins replied, sliding into the passenger seat while Jack took the wheel. As they pulled away from the hospital, Jack spotted the fake paramedics emerging onto the loading dock, scanning the area with evident frustration. In his rearview mirror, he saw one of them speaking urgently into a phone. "They'll be tracking us soon," Jack warned, taking an unexpected turn onto a side street. "Collins, there's a burner phone in the glove compartment. Call Sarah, tell her to meet us at the alternative location we discussed yesterday." The alternative location was an old ranger station deep in Piney Woods, part of Jack's contingency planning from the previous night. It was remote, defensible, and equipped with basic necessities, including a generator for power. As they drove, Dr. Carter continued checking the baby's vital signs. "She's stable, but I'm concerned about continuing her treatment under these conditions." "It won't be for long," Jack assured her, though uncertainty gnawed at him. He still had no solid lead on Ellie's whereabouts, and the forces aligned against them seemed to grow more formidable by the hour. The forest roads grew increasingly narrow and rough as they ventured deeper into Piney Woods. Jack navigated from memory, having patrolled these areas for years before becoming sheriff. "How much farther?" Collins asked, checking behind them periodically. "About 3 miles," Jack replied. "There's an old fire road ahead that—" He stopped abruptly, slowing. The truck. Ahead, in the middle of the dirt road, stood a red fox. It was perfectly still, amber eyes fixed on their approaching vehicle. "What is it?" Collins asked, following Jack's gaze. "Just a fox, Sheriff." But Jack felt a strange certainty as he recognized the animal. "No," he said quietly, "not just any fox." The animal held its ground as they approached, then deliberately turned and trotted to the side of the road. Rather than disappearing into the woods, it stopped, looking back at them expectantly. "Sheriff, we need to keep moving," Collins urged. Jack made a split-second decision, guided by an intuition he couldn't explain. "We're taking a detour." He turned the truck onto a barely visible trail where the fox had indicated. "Are you serious?" Collins stared at him incredulously. "Trust me," Jack said, keeping the fox in sight as it moved ahead of them, periodically stopping to ensure they were following. Dr. Carter, who had remained focused on her patient, now looked up in confusion. "Sheriff Miller, what's happening?" "I think," Jack said slowly, "we're being led to Ellie Wilson." The forest seemed to close in around them as Jack guided the truck deeper along the narrow trail. Branches scraped against the windows, and twice they nearly became stuck in muddy patches. Through it all, the fox remained visible ahead, moving with purpose. "This is insane," Collins muttered, gripping the dashboard as they bounced over a particularly rough section. "Following a wild animal into the middle of nowhere?" Jack didn't respond. His focus split between keeping the vehicle moving and tracking the russet form that occasionally appeared between the trees. Dr. Carter remained silent in the back seat, one hand steadying the baby's portable carrier, the other checking the oxygen monitor that beeped softly. Abruptly, the fox stopped at what appeared to be an impassable thicket. It looked back at them once more before slipping through a gap in the vegetation. Jack brought the truck to a halt. "End of the road," he said, reaching for his service weapon and checking it. Collins, stay with Dr. Carter and the baby. I'm going to check ahead. Jack, this is crazy, Collins protested. Let's stick to the original plan. The ranger station is defensible, has supplies. Something tells me we're exactly where we need to be, Jack replied, his expression resolute. Keep the engine running just in case. As Jack exited the vehicle, the dense forest enveloped him. He followed the narrow gap where the fox had disappeared, pushing through brambles and low-hanging branches. After about 30 yards, the vegetation suddenly opened up to reveal a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated hunter's cabin, its weathered logs and sagging roof suggesting decades of abandonment. The fox sat before the cabin's door as if waiting. When it saw Jack, it rose and moved to the side of the structure, stopping at what appeared to be a collapsed section of flooring inside. Jack approached cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of danger. The cabin door hung askew on rusted hinges, and he carefully pushed it open wider. The interior was dim, with shafts of sunlight penetrating through holes in the roof. Years of forest debris covered what remained of the furniture, a broken table, the skeleton of what might have been a chair, rusted cooking implements. His attention was drawn to where the fox waited, beside a section of floor that had clearly been disturbed recently. Fresh scratch marks suggested someone or something had worked to expose what lay beneath. "Hello?" Jack called softly, his hand on his holster. "Anyone here?" For a moment, silence answered him. Then, a rustling sound emerged from the gap in the floorboards, followed by a weak voice that sent a jolt of recognition through him. "Jack? Jack Miller? Ellie?" Jack moved quickly to the opening, kneeling to peer into the darkness below. "Ellie Wilson, is that you?" A pale face looked up at him from what appeared to be a small root cellar beneath the cabin. Ellie Wilson looked exhausted, her face gaunt and clothes dirty, but her eyes were clear and alert. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack glanced at the fox, which now sat watching them from a corner of the cabin. "You might not believe me if I told you." He helped Ellie climb out of the hiding space, supporting her as her legs threatened to buckle. "Are you hurt?" Ellie shook her head weakly. "Just hungry and tired. I've been hiding for days." Her eyes suddenly widened with fear. "My baby, she's safe," Jack assured her quickly. "In my truck with a doctor. She was sick, but she's being treated." Tears filled Ellie's eyes. "You found her in the woods?" With the fox," Jack confirmed. "Same one that led me. Here to you, I think." Ellie looked toward the animal, which remained motionless in the corner. "I thought I was hallucinating, or desperate enough to believe in childhood stories, but when I saw how it looked at my baby that night..." She trailed off, shaking her head in wonder. "We need to get you out of here," Jack said, helping her toward the door. "Prescott's men are searching the forest, and they're getting close." At the mention of Prescott, Ellie's grip on his arm tightened. "I have proof, Jack. Documents that show what he did. Forged deeds, bribes to county officials, threats to anyone who asked questions about the Elliott land rights. Your mother showed me. That's how we knew to look for you." Jack guided her carefully through the cabin doorway. "But right now, we need to focus on getting you and your daughter somewhere safe." As they emerged into the clearing, a sound from the forest edge made Jack freeze, the unmistakable metallic click of a weapon being readied. "That's far enough, Sheriff." A man stepped from the tree line, rifle aimed steadily at them. Two more armed men appeared from different positions, creating a loose circle. Jack recognized the leader as Gregory Holt, Prescott's head of security and a former military contractor known for his ruthless efficiency. "Quite a chase you've led us on," Holt remarked conversationally. "Mr. Prescott will be pleased we've found both mother and child." Jack kept his body partially in front of Ellie, his mind racing through limited options. His weapon was holstered, and even if he could draw it, they were outnumbered and outgunned. My deputy knows where we are, Jack bluffed. State police are already on their way. Holt smiled thinly. A convincing lie, Sheriff. But we both know. Your deputy is sitting in your truck about 50 yards that way, completely unaware of what's happening here. He gestured to one of his men. Check the vehicle, secure the infant. Jack tensed, preparing to make a desperate move despite the odds, when a sound from the forest caught everyone's attention. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Holt frowned, scanning the tree line. What the hell is that? The answer emerged from the forest in a blur of motion. Not one fox, but 3, then 5, then more, appearing from different directions. They moved, with coordinated purpose, circling the armed men, growling and snapping. "Shoot them!" Holt ordered, swinging his rifle toward the nearest fox. Before he could fire, more animals appeared, a pair of coyotes, several raccoons, even a young black bear. The unprecedented gathering of normally solitary and often adversarial species created a moment of stunned disbelief among Prescott's men. Jack seized the opportunity, drawing his weapon and shouting, "Drop your weapons, now!" The distraction worked. Holt's focus wavered just long enough for Jack to position himself better, gun trained steadily on the security chief. "This is insane," one of Holt's men muttered, backing away from a particularly aggressive fox that had moved within inches of his legs. The standoff might have continued if not for the sound of vehicles approaching, multiple engines growing louder. Moments later, Sarah Jenkins emerged from the forest path, weapon drawn, followed by 4 state troopers. "Everyone freeze! Weapons down!" Sarah commanded. Outnumbered and surrounded both by law enforcement and the inexplicable gathering of wildlife, Holt and his men slowly lowered their weapons. As the state troopers moved in to secure Prescott's men, the animals began to disperse, melting back into the forest as mysteriously as they had appeared. Only the original fox remained, sitting at the edge of the clearing, amber eyes fixed on Ellie. "I've never seen anything like that," Sarah said as she approached Jack and Ellie. "Those animals acted like they were protecting her," Jack finished, holstering his weapon. "Let's get Ellie to the truck. She needs to see her daughter." The reunion between mother and child took place in the back of Jack's truck, with Dr. Carter monitoring both patients. Ellie cradled her daughter, tears streaming down her face as she whispered promises and endearments. "She's going to be fine," Dr. Carter assured her. "The infection is responding to antibiotics, and there appear to be no lasting effects from her time in the forest." "What do we do now?" Collins asked Jack quietly as they stood a short distance away. "Prescott still has a lot of influence." "Not for long," Sarah interjected, joining them. "I made some calls last night to the State Attorney General's office. The documents Ellie collected show years of environmental violations in addition to the fraud. They're getting a warrant for Prescott's arrest as we speak." Jack nodded, relief washing over him. "And the baby?" "Legal heir to one of the largest natural gas deposits in the state," Sarah replied, "plus the original Elliott land holdings, which are substantial on their own." Jack looked back toward the truck, where Ellie continued to hold her daughter close. The fox had followed them and now sat nearby, still watching. The animal's presence no longer seemed strange to Jack. Rather, it felt like the completion of a circle, the fulfillment of some ancient promise. 3 months later, the Elliott Wilson estate stood at the center of what local media called the largest environmental conservation initiative in Maine's history. Ellie, fully recovered and recognized as the legitimate heir to the Elliott fortune, had committed the land and its resources to sustainable development and forest preservation. Seated in the sunroom of the newly renovated family home, Ellie adjusted her daughter Catherine's blanket as Martha Wilson looked on proudly. "The trust is officially established," Thomas announced, entering with a stack of papers. "The Elliott Wildlife Preserve will be protected for generations to come." Jack Miller, who had stopped by to share updates on the legal proceedings against James Prescott and his associates, nodded approvingly. Judge finalized the charges yesterday. Prescott's looking at 15 years minimum for fraud, conspiracy, and environmental violations. None of this would have happened without you, Jack, Ellie said gratefully. Or without... She trailed off, looking toward the forest edge visible from the window. Jack followed her gaze to where a familiar russet form could sometimes be glimpsed among the trees. The fox had become a regular visitor, keeping a respectful distance but always watchful. Some things defy explanation, Jack said softly. My grandfather used to tell stories about the Abenaki beliefs, that this forest had guardians who protected those who respected the land. Martha smiled, touching the silver pendant that now hung around little Catherine's neck. The Elliot family records mention something similar, a pact made by the first settlers with the original inhabitants, a promise to protect the forest in exchange for its protection. Most people would call it superstition, Thomas remarked. And what do you call it? Jack asked. Ellie looked down at her daughter, then back to the forest where the fox stood watching. I call it a sacred trust, she said simply. One we intend to honor. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Ellie stood at the edge of the woods with Catherine in her arms. The baby, now healthy and thriving, reached out toward the tree line where the fox had appeared. Thank you, Ellie said softly to the animal. I don't understand how or why you helped us, but I promise we'll protect your home as you protected mine. The fox seemed to consider her words, intelligent eyes reflecting the dying sunlight. Then, with a flick of its tail, it turned and disappeared into the gathering shadows of piney woods, leaving behind only footprints that the evening breeze would soon erase. In the years that followed, the story of the Fox Guardian became part of local folklore, told around campfires and whispered during forest walks. Some dismissed it as a fantastical embellishment of what had essentially been a corporate fraud case. Others, particularly those who had witnessed the inexplicable gathering of forest animals that day, remained silent but convinced of something beyond ordinary explanation. As for the Elliot Wilson family, they maintained a special relationship with the forest and its inhabitants. Little Catherine grew up with unusual companions, foxes that would appear at the property's edge, watching over her as she played. By the time she was old enough to understand, the story of how she had been saved had become a sacred family history, a testament to the mysterious bonds between humans and the natural world. On Catherine's 5th birthday, Ellie took her daughter to a special clearing in the heart of the preserve. There they placed a small bronze plaque beside a newly planted oak tree. The plaque bore a simple inscription, "For the guardians of piney woods. Some debts can never be repaid, only honored." As mother and daughter turned to leave, a familiar, russet shape emerged from the underbrush. The fox, older now but still alert and watchful, approached the plaque, sniffed it briefly, then looked up at Catherine. The little girl smiled and whispered, "Hello, friend." And in that moment, the bond between the forest and its human guardians was renewed once more, a silent promise passing from one generation to the next, to protect and preserve, to remember and honor, to respect the delicate balance between the wild and the civilized. As twilight descended over piney woods, the fox returned to the shadows, its duty fulfilled yet never truly complete. For as long as the Elliot line continued, as long as the ancient pact remained honored, the fox and its descendants would remain, silent, vigilant, and ever watchful over those who had become, in their own way, guardians of the forest. Dear listeners, we hope you've been captivated by Ellie and Catherine's extraordinary journey through the mystical piney woods. If this tale of unlikely guardians and sacred bonds has touched your heart, we've prepared a special playlist with equally moving stories about the mysterious connections between humans and the natural world. Find it by clicking the link to your left. If you enjoyed this emotional adventure, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore life's complexity and the magic that sometimes exists just beyond our understanding. What Guardian stories do you have from your own life? We're waiting to hear from you in the comments.